They told us the estate was empty. That was the first thing. The very first thing they said when we pulled through those iron gates at 7:30 in the morning, that the estate had been unoccupied for 11 days, and that we were simply there to conduct a routine inspection before the household reopened for the autumn season. Routine. I've worked in royal household compliance for going on 16 years. I've walked the corridors of 3 official residences, 2 ceremonial estates, and 1 private manor that technically doesn't exist on any public record. I know what routine looks like. I know what it smells like. I know the particular silence of a house that's been properly closed up. That dry, still, dusty quiet that settles over rooms when no one's been inside for more than a week. Aldenmere didn't smell like that. Aldenmere smelled like someone had been cooking. Let me take you back to the beginning, not the beginning of that morning, further back. Because to understand what we found inside that estate, you have to understand what Aldenmere was and what it represented, and why it mattered to everyone involved. Aldenmere House sits on the western edge of a private estate in the county of Denshall, a stretch of countryside that doesn't appear on most tourist maps, protected by a combination of private land agreements and a very old, very polite arrangement between the landowners and the Crown. The estate itself is about 400 acres. The house at the center of it is Georgian, built in the 1740s, expanded twice in the Victorian period, and restored at considerable expense in the early 2000s. It has 42 rooms. 7 of them are permanently locked. Even I haven't been inside all 7. The house belongs, officially, to the Harcliffe Royal Household Trust, a legal body that manages properties connected to the extended royal family. In practice, it had been used for decades as the private residence of the Duchess of Aldenmere, Lady Rosalind Thorne. Not a working royal, technically, a title by marriage, but Rosalind Thorne is one of those people whose presence in a room changes the temperature of it. Elegant in the old-fashioned sense. Precise. Controlled. The kind of woman who could end a conversation with a look and make the other person feel grateful for it. She had been in Switzerland since the 14th of September. That was the official record. At least that's what it said. Our team was 3 people. Myself, Declan Marsh, Senior Compliance Inspector for the Household Trust, and 2 colleagues. A woman named Priya Okafor, who handled documentation and estate records, and a younger man, Thomas Hewitt, who was technically on secondment from the Lord Chamberlain's office, and who had the unfortunate habit of writing everything down in a notebook with a green cover even when it wasn't necessary. Thomas wrote things down constantly. I used to find it irritating. By the end of that week, I was grateful for every single word. We arrived at Aldenmere at 7:23. The gates were opened remotely by the estate's security contractor, a firm called Ashford Security, based out of Swindon. Standard arrangement. The caretaker, a man named Gerald Pugg, who had worked the property for 22 years, was supposed to meet us at the front entrance. He wasn't there. That was the second thing. We waited for about 4 minutes. Priya called the number we had for Gerald. It rang 7 times and went to voicemail. She left a message. Thomas wrote the time in his green notebook. "Could be out the back," I said. "Could be," said Priya. She didn't sound convinced. We had a key, the master entry for the front door, issued through the trust. I used it. The door opened into the main entrance hall, and that's when I noticed the smell. Not immediately, it crept in the way smells do in large houses, layered under the baseline cold of stone and old carpet. But it was there, unmistakable. Warm food. Recent cooking, something with onions. I stopped walking. "You smell that?" I said. Priya had already stopped. She nodded once. Thomas looked between us. "What is it?" "Someone's been in here," I said, "recently." That should not have been possible. The estate had been officially closed since the 14th. The security logs showed no entry in 11 days. No alarms triggered. No movement detected on the internal sensors. Everything on paper said this house was empty. But standing in that entrance hall with the pale morning light coming in through the tall windows and the smell of cooked food drifting from somewhere further inside, every instinct I had was telling me that someone was here. Or had been here very, very recently. I radioed Ashford Security before we went any further. Standard protocol, if there's any indication of unauthorized presence, you stop, you report, you wait for confirmation before proceeding. The man who answered was called Whitmore. He checked the logs while I waited, and his answer was the same. No entry recorded. No alarm activations. Nothing. "The sensors are functioning?" I asked. "All green," he said. "Been green all week." "Pull the footage from the internal cameras for the last 48 hours. A pause. "Sir, we only hold 72 hours of interior footage before it overwrites." "I know, pull it." Another pause, longer. "Sir, the interior cameras for Aldenmere have been showing static since Tuesday." I stood very still. "Define static," I said. "No signal. Cameras are present and connected, but they've been returning a blank feed. We logged it as a technical fault and flagged it for maintenance." "When were you going to tell the trust about that?" The pause this time was the kind that told me he was choosing his words carefully. "It was escalated internally, sir. I can only speak to what's in my system." I ended the call. A blind spot. 11 days of no camera footage from the interior of a 42-room house, and sensors that had apparently failed to detect whatever or whoever had been inside. "We need to walk the house," I told Priya and Thomas. "Every room, systematically. Don't touch anything, don't open anything without documenting it first." Thomas had already opened his green notebook. "And call in," I said. "Let the trust know we may have a situation." Priya made the call while Thomas and I started with the ground floor. We moved room by room, the entrance hall, the library, the morning room, the formal dining room, the smaller family sitting room that overlooked the south garden. Everything looked undisturbed. Furniture covered in dust sheets, curtains drawn, the careful, deliberate stillness of a properly managed closed house. Until the kitchen. The kitchen at Aldenmere is not a small room. It's an original Victorian service kitchen, long, high-ceilinged, with a stone floor and a row of deep copper pots hanging above the main preparation counter. Modern appliances had been added discreetly over the years, but the bones of the room were old. There were 2 ranges, a large refrigeration unit that ran on an independent power supply, and a walk-in pantry along the far wall. The kitchen smelled strongly of food, recent, definite, unmistakable. On the main preparation counter there was a chopping board, a wooden one, old, seasoned, clearly belonging to the house. On it the dried residue of what looked like onion and carrot, not ancient, not weeks old. 2 days, maybe 3 at the outside. Beside the chopping board, a single mug, white, washed and turned upside down on the drying rack. Someone had cooked here. Someone had eaten here. Someone had washed up their mug and put it neatly on the rack, and then, apparently, vanished without triggering a single sensor or leaving a single mark on the security system. Thomas photographed everything. I stood in the middle of that kitchen and turned slowly, looking at the room, trying to understand what I was seeing. The walk-in pantry door was slightly ajar. I crossed the kitchen, pushed the pantry door open. The lights inside were off, motion-activated, and they came on as I stepped in. Standard pantry, shelves of dry goods, tinned vegetables, flour, the kind of preserved staples that a household keeps on hand for long periods. Nothing unusual. Except on the 3rd shelf from the bottom, in the gap between 2 large tins of tomatoes, a mobile phone. A modern one, decent make, face down. I did not touch it. I took a photograph with my own phone. Then I backed out of the pantry and called Priya. She came into the kitchen, saw my expression, and understood immediately. "How recent?" she said. "No idea, but the camera blankout started Tuesday, and someone's been cooking in here." I gestured toward the pantry. "There's a phone in there." "Whose?" "That," I said, "is what I intend to find out." We finished the ground floor. Nothing else immediately out of place, but once you knew what to look for, small things began to surface. A cushion on a settee in the morning room that was slightly off-center, not dramatically, but enough that someone had clearly sat on it recently and replaced it in a hurry. A window latch in the secondary study that had been unlocked and then relocked from the inside. A small bin in the downstairs cloakroom that had been emptied and a fresh liner inserted. But the liner was slightly damp, as though whatever had been inside it had been recently removed. Someone had been very careful, but not quite careful enough. By mid-morning, Priya had reached the trust's administrative lead, a man named Forsyth, who listened to her account in near silence and then said 3 words before ending the call. "Don't touch anything." 40 minutes later, a car arrived. Two people got out. They were polite, professionally expressionless, and they did not tell us their full names. The investigation had just moved into a completely different category. One of them, the woman, who introduced herself simply as Hale, walked through the kitchen without speaking, surveyed the pantry, and then stood at the preparation counter for a long time, looking at the chopping board and the mug. "You found it exactly like this?" she said. "Exactly. We documented before we touched anything." She looked at Thomas's green notebook. "May I?" Thomas impressively looked at me first. I nodded. She flipped through the pages slowly, reading his handwriting. Her face gave nothing away. "Good," she said finally, handing it back. "You did this correctly." Her colleague, a quiet man she called Porter, had already moved upstairs. The upper floors were where the story changed. We hadn't gone above ground level, yet standard protocol was to sweep from the bottom up, and we'd been stopped by the arrival of Hale and Porter. But now, following Porter up the main staircase, the atmosphere in the house shifted. Or maybe it was just me. Maybe I was more primed to notice things, but the upper corridor felt different, heavier somehow, the kind of still that isn't quite the same as empty. There are 14 bedrooms in the main house at Aldenmere. The Duchess's private suite takes up the east wing of the first floor, 4 rooms, a sitting room, a dressing room, a bedroom, and a private bathroom. These rooms were normally locked during a household closure, with the keys held by the estate manager. Gerald Pugg, the caretaker, who still had not answered his phone. Porter stopped outside the door to the Duchess's suite. He tried the handle. It was unlocked. He looked back at me. I looked at Hale. She gave a very small nod. Porter opened the door. The Duchess's sitting room was warm. Not room temperature warm, actively, recently, deliberately warm. The electric radiator on the far wall was on. Someone had switched it on, and it had been running long enough to take the chill out of the entire room. The curtains on the south-facing windows were drawn, but a thin line of morning light cut across the floor where they didn't quite meet. On the writing desk in the corner, the beautiful old walnut desk that I'd documented in 3 previous inspections and never seen anything on top of, there was a letter. Handwritten, 3 pages, folded once. Porter crossed the room in 4 steps and crouched to look at it without touching. He read it for a long time. When he stood, his expression had changed. Not dramatically, just something behind the eyes, a sharpening, the look of a person who has just understood something they didn't expect to understand. "We need to make a call," he said to Hale. "From here." "Now," he said. She already had the phone to her ear. "I will tell you what I know about that letter, because it became relevant to everything that followed, and because parts of it were eventually disclosed in the inquiry. It was addressed to Lady Rosalind Thorne, the Duchess, in handwriting that was later confirmed to belong to her. She had written it herself, to herself. That's not as strange as it sounds. People write things down to make them real, to make themselves face what they already know. And what the letter said in 3 careful, steady pages was that Lady Rosalind Thorne had been inside Aldenmere for at least 6 of the 11 days since the estate officially closed. That she had not gone to Switzerland. That the Switzerland story was a cover, arranged with the assistance of at least one person inside the household management structure. She had been hiding. The letter explained, in that careful handwriting, exactly why. But the part that made Porter pick up the phone, the part that made Hale's voice go completely flat and professional when she made her call, was the last paragraph. I didn't read it directly. Porter read portions of it aloud, and I wrote down what I could while Thomas wrote down everything. What it said, and I will give you the substance of it, not the exact words, was that the Duchess had discovered something in the estate's private records. Something that had been there for a long time, buried under the ordinary administration of the household, unremarked upon. Something involving the estate's financial accounts, and involving a name that, when Porter said it quietly to Hale across that warm, curtained room, made her stop talking mid-sentence. That name is not part of this account, not yet, not until the inquiry releases it formally. But it is a name I recognized, and I will tell you this much, it wasn't small, it wasn't a minor estate matter. And when I heard it, standing in the Duchess of Aldenmere's private sitting room at 11:40 in the morning on a Thursday in October, I understood why she had been hiding. And I understood why someone had gone to considerable trouble to make sure the security cameras had stopped working. They found Gerald Pugh at 2 in the afternoon. He was in the groundskeeper's cottage, a half-mile walk from the main house through a formal garden. He was sitting at his kitchen table with a cup of tea that had gone cold, and he was, according to the officer who found him, completely calm, almost unnaturally so, as if he'd been waiting. "I knew you'd come," he said. "I expected it'd be sooner, honestly." He'd been the one keeping the heating on. He'd been the one bringing food. He'd been the one who had stayed on the estate during the closure, under the official record, because the Duchess had asked him to, not formally, not in writing, just asked him, the way people ask when they are frightened and they need someone they trust. He'd served the Aldenmere estate for 22 years. He'd been loyal to Lady Rosalind since before the title. He wasn't going to turn her away. "Where is she now?" Hale asked him. Gerald looked at his cold cup of tea for a moment. "Safe," he said. "That's not an answer to the question." He looked up. "I know," he said. "But it's the only one I'm giving you." They brought Gerald Pugh to a room in the main house, the library, which felt appropriate in a grim sort of way, and they sat him down and they were polite to him, because there was no reason to be anything else. He was not a suspect. He was not under arrest. He was a witness who happened to be in possession of information that several people in a government car park in central London were now very anxious to have. Gerald Pugh sat across from Hale and answered questions in the measured, deliberate way of a man who has already decided exactly what he will and will not say, and who has made that decision calmly, with full understanding of the consequences. He told them how long the Duchess had been in the house. He told them what she'd needed: food, heat, a working phone charged from the groundskeeper's cottage generator so that the main house power logs stayed clean. He told them the date she arrived. He did not tell them where she was now. I was not in that room. I was in the corridor outside, standing with Thomas and Priya, doing what compliance inspectors do in a situation that has completely exceeded our brief, waiting, watching, and staying out of the way. Thomas was still writing. "You all right?" Priya said to me. "I've been better," I said. She nodded. She had her arms crossed, and she was looking at the library door the way people look at things they're not sure are real. "That letter," she said. Porter's face when he read it. "I know. Do you think she's still on the estate?" I thought about that. About a woman methodical enough to run the cameras blind for 11 days, careful enough to leave almost no trace, but human enough to leave a mug on a drying rack and to write herself a letter she then forgot to take with her. "No," I said, "but I don't think she's far." The afternoon moved slowly. More cars arrived. A man from the Lord Chamberlain's office who was not Thomas's supervisor but was clearly above him. He arrived around 1:30 and immediately took over the south study as an operations room. He was in his 50s, trim, authoritative, with the kind of face that had probably always looked slightly tired. His name was Harrington. He spoke to Hale for about 12 minutes and then came out and looked at me. "You're Marsh," he said. "Yes." "You found the phone, and the food residue, and the letter. And you documented it correctly before you touched anything. Standard procedure." He studied me for a moment. "Good," he said, and then he walked back into the south study. Priya raised an eyebrow at me. I said nothing. The phone from the pantry had been bagged and removed by Porter. I didn't know whose it was then. I know now, because it came out in the inquiry. It belonged to a man named Ellis Crane. He was a solicitor. He had been connected to the management of the Aldenmere estate accounts for 8 years. He was also, it turned out, the person who had disabled the interior camera feed, not through Ashford Security directly, but through a technical backdoor in the estate's network that he had arranged to be installed during a routine maintenance upgrade 3 years earlier. A backdoor that no one had noticed, that had been sitting there, quiet and invisible, for 3 years. When I heard that detail later, weeks later, in a briefing room, I thought about all the routine inspections that had come before mine, all the ticks in all the boxes, all the reports saying everything was fine, and somewhere in the infrastructure of that house, a door that shouldn't have existed, waiting to be used. At 3:15, Harrington came out of the south study and said something to Hale that I couldn't hear. She listened, nodded, and then looked across the corridor at me. "Marsh," she said, "walk with me." We went out through the main entrance, down the stone steps, and into the front drive. It was a cold October afternoon. the kind of light that turns everything golden and slightly mournful, low sun cutting across the formal hedgerows at a sharp angle. My breath came out in small clouds. "The letter," she said. "You heard Porter read portions of it." "Parts of it." "What did you understand it to mean?" I thought about being careful. I thought about the 16 years of professional restraint that are basically built into the job. And then I thought about that warm room, and that letter, and the particular way Porter's expression had changed. "I understood it to mean," I said, "that the Duchess found evidence of something significant in the estate's financial records, something that connected to a name above her in the administrative chain. And I understood it to mean that she became frightened enough to fake a foreign trip rather than report it through normal channels." Hale was quiet for a moment. The gravel crunched under her feet. "And why would someone in her position use normal channels to report something rather than come to people like us directly?" "Because," I said, "she didn't know if people like you were safe." Hale nodded once. It wasn't confirmation of anything specific. It was the nod of a person who has been told something accurate. "Keep your phone on," she said. "You may be called to give a formal account of your morning." She went back inside. I stood in the drive for a while, looking at the hedgerows and the long, flat stretch of lawn that ran down to the tree line. The estate was quiet. Somewhere beyond those trees, the autumn afternoon was going about its business. The county roads, the farm traffic, the ordinary countryside doing its ordinary things. None of it knew any of this was happening. That's the thing about old houses. They hold a great deal of silence. They found the Duchess at 4:30. Not on the estate, just beyond it. There was a small dower house at the far edge of the Aldenmere grounds, separated from the main estate by a ha-ha and a line of old oak trees. Technically separate property, a different title, different utility accounts, historically used by family members during estate transitions. It hadn't been flagged as part of the closure inspection because it wasn't, strictly speaking, part of the household's managed inventory. She was there, she had been there since, they calculated later, about 3 days into her stay. She'd moved from the main house to the dower house when she'd heard that an inspection had been scheduled. Gerald had told her. She'd packed what she needed into one bag and walked across the lawn in the dark, through the trees, and settled into that small house with a wood stove and a set of files she had carried with her from the main estate's records room. 3 weeks' worth of documents, meticulously organized, the kind of organization that speaks to someone who has been thinking about this moment for a very long time. Harrington went to her. He took Hale with him. They were there for nearly 2 hours. I don't know everything that was said. I wasn't in the room. What I know is what came out afterward. That Lady Rosalind Thorne handed over the files without hesitation. That she had been waiting in that small house with her wood stove and her documents for someone she trusted to arrive. And that Harrington was, apparently, a person she felt she could trust. She had asked for him specifically, through Gerald, through a chain of communication that had been running quietly in parallel to everything else all day. She had known when we walked through those gates at 7:23 that we would come. She had set the breadcrumbs herself, the chopping board, the mug, the phone in the pantry. She hadn't forgotten to take that letter with her. She'd left it deliberately. That changed everything. The whole morning rearranged itself in my mind, every mistake, every trace of evidence suddenly revealed as deliberate, not carelessness, architecture. She had built a trail precise enough to be found by people who knew how to look, and obscure enough to be missed by anyone who was simply ticking boxes. The phone in the pantry belonged to Ellis Crane. She had found it. How she'd found it, what it was doing in her house, how it had come to be there, that's part of the inquiry. What matters is that she had found it, understood what it meant, and kept it as evidence rather than destroying it. The mug on the drying rack, the only sign of recent human activity in a kitchen that was otherwise clean, was placed precisely where a careful inspector would not miss it. The letter on the desk was the last resort, a story written in her own hand that explained everything if nothing else worked. She was not hiding, she was waiting. She was waiting for someone to come in and do exactly what Priya and Thomas and I did on a cold October morning, to look carefully, to document correctly, and to follow the thread. I sat in the main library at Aldenmere for a while after things had quieted down, waiting to be formally interviewed. Thomas was beside me, still writing in his green notebook. The room was tall and cold. The heating in this part of the house hadn't been switched on, with long shelves of books that had that particular slightly dusty smell of volumes that are displayed more than they're read. "You think she's all right?" Thomas said. He was young, he asked the direct questions. "Physically, I think she's fine," I said. "She had supplies, she had heat. She'd been organized about it." But she's been frightened for a long time," I said. "That kind of thing takes something out of a person." He turned his pen over in his fingers. "What do you think she found in the accounts?" "Something that didn't belong there." "But what kind of something?" I looked at the bookshelves, thought about the name Porter had said quietly in that warm room, a name I recognized from briefings and meeting agendas, and the ordinary bureaucratic landscape of a career spent near the edges of institutional power. "Something someone wanted very much to stay hidden," I said. "That's all I can tell you." Thomas wrote that down. Then he looked at what he'd written, crossed it out, and wrote something else. "I'll just put that the investigation was ongoing," he said. "Good lad," I said. Gerald Pugh was released at 6 in the evening. He had told them what he was going to tell them, and nothing else, and they didn't have cause to hold him. He walked through the library on his way out and paused at the doorway. "You're the ones who found it," he said. He was looking at me. "We found what was meant to be found," I said. He considered that. "She said, when she was planning it all, she said the most important thing was to make sure the right people were looking, not just any inspector, someone who actually cared about getting it right." He glanced at Thomas's notebook, then back at me. "She was counting on it." He left. The fire he'd lit in the groundskeeper's cottage was probably still warm. He'd be back there tonight, in the house where he'd lived for 22 years, and the estate would be busy with investigators and documentation and whatever comes next. I hoped he got some sleep. My formal interview was brief, 40 minutes, with Harrington conducting it and a recorder on the table between us. He asked clear questions. I gave clear answers. Thomas's notes were referenced 3 times. At the end, Harrington looked at his hands for a moment. "You had no prior indication this would be anything other than routine," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "None," I said. "The briefing was completely standard." "And yet you stopped when you smelled the cooking." "It didn't fit." He nodded slowly. 16 years of inspections. "About that. Things stop fitting, and you know." "Yes." He gathered his papers. "Your report will be considered a primary document in the formal inquiry. I'd ask that you make yourself available for further questions over the coming weeks." "Of course." "And Marsh," he paused with his hand on the folder. "The decision to call in rather than proceed before you'd confirmed anything, that was the correct call, for the record." I said nothing because there wasn't anything to say. It had been standard procedure. But I understood he was telling me something else. That, in a situation where the procedural instinct had been to push forward and find out what was wrong, pausing to report had protected the integrity of everything that followed. Had made it usable. "Thank you," I said. He left. I was in the entrance hall at 7:30, putting my coat on. The estate was lit up, windows in the south study, the library, the upstairs corridor. More people had arrived while I was being interviewed. The house that had been sleeping was now fully, busily awake. Priya was waiting for me outside. She'd found a bench on the front steps and was sitting on it in the cold, looking at the dark shape of the formal hedgerows against the evening sky. "They're going to be here for days," she said. "Weeks, probably." "Did he tell you anything in the interview?" "Not really," he asked. I answered, "That's how it works." She was quiet. "Do you think she knew what she was risking, staying here?" "Setting all that up." I sat down beside her. The gravel drive was very quiet, just the distant sound of a generator running somewhere at the back of the house. "I think," I said, "she knew exactly what she was risking, and she did it anyway." Priya looked at the hedgerows. "That's brave." "It's something," I said. We sat there for a bit, the two of us, while the house behind us went on being awake. 3 weeks later, the inquiry was still running. The estate was still technically cordoned. Softly, politely, the way institutional investigations often are, and I was back at my desk in London doing ordinary work when the news came through about the bomb. Not at Aldenmere, nowhere near Denshall. Hyde Park. Let me tell you about that day. because it happened during the same 3 weeks, and because it is connected. Not directly, not in any way the inquiry formally acknowledged, but connected the way things sometimes are when they exist in the same moment in history, when the ground beneath a country is shifting, and people who are paid to notice things are noticing different things at the same time. The bomb went off at 11:40 in the morning on a Wednesday, 3 weeks and 2 days after we'd walked through the gates at Aldenmere. It wasn't a large device. That came out very quickly in the official statements, and it mattered. Not a large device targeted, placed near the eastern vehicle entrance to the park. 15 people were injured, none fatally. The morning was cold and gray, and the kind of mid-October weekday where the park is busy enough to be dangerous, but not so full that the outcome couldn't have been controlled. I wasn't near Hyde Park that day. I was sitting at my desk when my phone started going. News notifications, a text from Priya, "You seeing this?" A call from an unknown number that I let ring. But I know what happened at Hyde Park that morning. I know it because a colleague of mine, a man named Raymond Voss, who had been doing event security work on secondment to the Metropolitan Operations team, was there. He's told the story in his own way, several times, to several different people. I'm going to tell it the way he told me, which is to say in the voice of someone who saw it and still isn't entirely comfortable with what he saw. Because what he saw was a guard who didn't move. The eastern vehicle entrance to Hyde Park is managed on busy event days by a small rotation of officers from the Household Cavalry Mounted Regiment, not in their ceremonial capacity, in a security liaison role, coordinating with the park's authority and the Metropolitan Police. It's a hybrid arrangement, more common than people realize. On the morning in question, there were 2 officers at the eastern entrance. One of them was a man named Corporal Thomas Ainsley. Raymond was stationed about 60 meters further into the park, near the path that runs parallel to the Serpentine. He heard the blast before he understood what it was, a sound that he described as a pressure first more than a noise, like the air hiccuped. And then the noise, and then immediately after it, chaos, screams, people running in every direction. The instinct to flee that overtakes rational thought in about 2 seconds when something like that happens. Raymond moved toward the sound. That's training, you move toward it, not away. He was trying to get a sight line on the eastern entrance when he saw Corporal Ainsley. And Corporal Ainsley had not moved. He was standing at his post, right there in the entrance, while people streamed past him and around him, and the dust was still settling, and someone 3 meters away was on the ground, and people were screaming. He was standing there with his back straight and his face forward, and he was directing. That's the word Raymond used, directing people away from the immediate zone. Pointing, clear hand signals. A voice like a road, Raymond said, just consistent. Even. There was a woman who ran directly into him and he caught her, steadied her, pointed her in the right direction, and returned to his post in the same movement. A child had been separated from a parent. This happened in the first 30 seconds, in the absolute worst of it. The child was maybe 4 years old, sitting on the path about 10 meters from the entrance, crying in that wide-open, silent way that children cry when they are too frightened for noise. Ainsley saw him. Raymond watched Ainsley make a decision in about half a second, step off the post, go to the child, pick him up. He held the child with one arm, continued directing the flow of people with the other hand, and called for a civilian to take the child and carry him to the designated assembly point. Then he went back to his post. Raymond said, "I've done security for 11 years, I've done drills, I've been in 2 incidents before that one, smaller than that, but incidents. And I thought I understood what discipline looked like. Standing there watching him, I understood that I'd had a theoretical understanding of it. What he had was something different. He wasn't suppressing the fear. I genuinely don't think he was afraid. Not because he didn't understand what had happened, he understood perfectly, but he'd made peace with it somewhere. He'd filed it, and he was just doing the job. I've thought about that image a great deal since Raymond told me. A man standing at a post while the world comes apart around him, not because he doesn't feel it, but because the feeling and the function have been separated. The feeling is real and present, and the function is real and present, and he's holding both of them without letting either destroy the other. The child was reunited with his mother at the assembly point. She'd been caught in the initial flow of people moving away from the blast and had lost him in the crowd. When she found him, carried safely, calm, apparently having been distracted from his fear by the brass buttons on Corporal Ainsley's uniform, she sat down on the ground right there and couldn't get up for about 5 minutes. Nobody blamed her. The bomb, as it turned out, was connected to a wider operation that the inquiry into the Aldenmere situation was separately examining. I don't know all the connections. I'm not cleared for all of them, and the full picture is still incomplete. What I know, what I was told in a briefing room 3 weeks after the Aldenmere inspection, is that Ellis Crane, the solicitor whose phone Lady Rosalind had found in her pantry, had been a link in something considerably larger than one estate's mismanaged accounts. That the financial irregularities she had discovered were one thread in a fabric that included, at its edges, people and connections and flows of money that the intelligence community had been watching for some time. I was not told more than that. It wasn't my clearance, but I was told enough to understand why she had been frightened, and why the camera feed had been disabled, and why the Switzerland story had been constructed with such care. Someone had known she was getting close to something, and someone had taken steps. The steps hadn't worked, because Gerald Pugh loved that estate more than he feared whoever was watching it. Because a woman in a dower house with a wood stove had 22 years of institutional memory on her side, and the patience to wait for the right people to arrive. And because Thomas Hewitt wrote everything down in a green notebook, and Priya Ockhafer noticed a smell, and I had the instinct to stop and call rather than push forward and disturb the evidence. Small things, they are always small things in the end. I went back to Aldenmere once more, 6 weeks after the initial inspection. This time it wasn't routine, it was a formal evidence walkthrough, me and Harrington and 2 people from a different department whose function I wasn't entirely clear on. We went through the same rooms in the same order: the kitchen, the pantry, the Duchess's suite. The dower house, which I hadn't seen before, a small, old-fashioned place with low ceilings and flagstone floors, and a wood stove that still smelled faintly of ash. On the windowsill of the dower house's main room, someone had left a single thing behind. Not deliberately, or maybe deliberately, I couldn't be certain. A small glass paperweight, clear with a blue swirl in the center. Old, the kind of object that lives on a desk for decades and gets moved without thinking. Harrington picked it up, looked at it, set it back down. "Leave it," he said. "It's not evidential." We left it. The formal inquiry published its preliminary findings 4 months after that. I've read the public version. It is accurate as far as it goes, which is not as far as the full version. The names that appear in it are the names that were always going to appear, the people it was possible to name, the connections it was safe to establish. Ellis Crane, 2 associates, a financial structure that had been operating for 9 years across 3 different jurisdictions. Lady Rosalind Thorne's name appears in the report as a witness and a source. Nothing more. There is 1 paragraph, brief, formal, written in the particular bloodless language of official findings, that acknowledges that her decision to retain and preserve evidence at considerable personal risk was material to the inquiry's success. 1 paragraph. It doesn't capture the wood stove, or the cold walk across the lawn in the dark, or the letter she wrote to herself to make the fear real and the facts clear. It doesn't capture 22 years of Gerald Pugh walking that estate in all weathers. It doesn't capture the precise, careful architecture of the bread trail she left. The mug, the phone, the letter, calculated to be found by the right kind of attention. It says, material to the inquiry's success. That'll have to do. Corporal Thomas Ainsley received a commendation. It was quiet, not a ceremony, not a public announcement. Raymond told me about it in the way he told me most things, over a coffee, in passing, as though he was mentioning something peripheral rather than the whole point. "He's back on duty," Raymond said. "Same unit, same rotation." "How is he?" Raymond considered. "He's exactly the same," he said. "That's the thing. He's just exactly the same." I thought about that. What it meant to go through a blast, hold a post, carry a child, direct a panicking crowd, and then go back to exactly the same, not unchanged, because you can't be unchanged by something like that, but functional. Present, doing the job. There are different kinds of courage. The obvious kind is the one people write about, the dramatic, visible, sudden kind, where a decision is made in a flash and everything hangs on it. But there is another kind. The kind that has been built so slowly over so many ordinary days that when the extraordinary day arrives, it is simply already there, not assembled in the moment, just present. Ainsley had been practicing for that moment his entire career. He didn't know it. but every ordinary day on an ordinary post was a kind of practice, a kind of readiness, so that when the air hiccuped and the world came apart, the readiness was already in him, already formed, already doing exactly what it was supposed to do. I think about Rosalind Thorne and Thomas Ainsley in the same thought sometimes, not because they are alike exactly, but because they represent the same thing at different scales. The decision to hold the post, the decision not to run, the willingness to stand in the place you are supposed to stand, even when every instinct says that standing is the most dangerous thing you can do. She stood her post in a dour house with a wood stove and a pile of files and a glass paperweight on a windowsill. He stood his post in an entrance to Hyde Park while the dust was still settling. Neither of them made headlines. Neither of them will, really. But the things they held together, by staying where they were, those things matter. They ripple forward. They make other things possible. They keep a thread of something intact: accountability, order, the basic principle that wrongdoing can be found and named and faced, that might otherwise have been cut quietly and cleanly and never noticed. I'm writing this because someone should. The official records will say what they say. The inquiry will close eventually, the way inquiries close, with the language of findings and recommendations and the polite institutional acknowledgement that things happened that shouldn't have happened, and that steps will be taken. Gerald Pugh will go on walking his estate. Thomas Hewitt, who is better at this job than I gave him credit for on that first morning, will go on writing in green notebooks. And somewhere in England, in a residence that I probably shouldn't name, a woman sits at a desk, a different desk from the one in the Duchess's suite, I assume, and goes about the ordinary business of a life that is not any longer lived in fear. She hasn't sent a message. There was no dramatic conclusion, no handshake, no thank you, no formal acknowledgement from her personally. That's not how it works. It was never going to be how it worked. But Harrington, in that brief conversation on the front drive 6 weeks after everything, said something I've kept with me. She asked, he said, whether the people who found it were careful. What did you tell her? I told her they were. A pause. She said, I know they had to be or it wouldn't have worked. I drove home from Aldenmere the first night, that cold October evening with the generator humming and the house lit up behind me, and I sat in the car in the drive for a minute before I started the engine. The estate stretched out around me in the dark. 400 acres of countryside that holds its history quietly and gives nothing away unless you know exactly where to look. 42 rooms. 7 permanently locked. I've been inside 34 of them now. The other 7 are still waiting.